All right, thanks. Is my mic okay? All right, so thank you for attending my talk. Myself, I'm a PhD student of Radboud University. My research focuses mainly on cryptographic systems in the wild, and I'm also an independent security researcher at Midnight Blue Labs. This was a collaboration with Bernard van Gastel. He's an assistant professor at the Open University, also in the Netherlands, and he focuses mainly on correctness of systems. So, what is a self-encrypting drive? Well, it's supposed to be obvious, but it's just a handful of slides. So, in traditional encryption, you have like an encryption key, an algorithm, and some plain text coming in, and ciphertext going out, which is then stored in a storage medium. And obviously, you're not supposed to be able to recover anything from that ciphertext that you store in the storage medium. The difference is here, in self-encrypting approach, is that everything's integrated into a single say device. So so all the hassle of encrypting is all done for you. So basically everything that you store in the drive will end up encrypted and become decrypted once you unlock the drive. So basically you start up your PC, you enter a password, and then all the encryption is done for you.
Can I adjust your microphone?
Yes. Okay, so these things aren't magical devices. These are just ARM cores, in fact, which run software. And you can see that from data sheets. Here's another. And in fact, even these things have like JTAG connectors, like lots of them, not all of them. And there's another example of one of those. And if marketing deserves any credibility, you should run to your hardware store today and ditch all your software encryption and change it with hardware because it's supposed to be superior. Like in a management point of view, like key management, that may make some sense. But in terms of security, that's definitely not true. But we'll get to that later. Oh, by the way, BitLocker, the full disk encryption tool integrated into Microsoft Windows, by default trusts these drives to do a good job. So if it detects that your drive supports self-encryption, it will actually delegate it to the drive and do nothing on its own. So what are the actual security guarantees of these things? First, we'll take a theoretical approach. We'll dive into the practice later. So there's typically 3 attacker models in full disk encryption, and all of them involve physical access by an adversary. So the first one, your PC is on. Second, the PC is off, and the victim is not aware that there's been physical access. And the third is the PC is off, and the victim is actually aware. So you cannot rely on the victim entering any secret key information whatsoever, or the drive is lost or stolen, which ends up in the same situation. So let's first look at this scenario. So software encryption is inherently weak if the PC is on. And that's because the secret key is kept in RAM, and it needs that to operate. So in this situation, there's cold boot attacks. So basically reboot the PC and then run a custom OS and extract the key from RAM. Or DMA attacks through some DMA interface. And hardware encryption is immune to this in theory because the key is not supposed to be stored in RAM. However, in practice, it is almost always stored in RAM, and that's in order to support suspend to RAM. So that's a standby mode, and basically if you put your PC into this mode, then the PC will turn off all the peripheral devices, and when you turn it back on, then the drive is locked and it needs to be unlocked again. And as a user, you don't have to enter a key. So guess where the key came from? Exactly, that was all the time it was in RAM. Another thing is that the keys may not necessarily be in the RAM of the host PC, but it needs to be in the controller, and those aren't that's not secure hardware by any standard. Like in fact, there's even debugging interfaces on the PCB for many of them. And finally, you can always just hot plug the drive. If the PC is on, the drive's unlocked, you can hot plug the drive, and that's not just a theoretical thing. That's been done before. So overall, the attack opportunities are pretty much equivalent. It doesn't really add anything, the hardware approach. So the other attacker model is PC is off and the victim is unaware. So this calls for the evil maid attack. You can install backdoor functionality, wait for the victim to enter the secret key, and then extract all the data that you want. Like there's a hardware key logger, for example, or a backdoor in the bootloader. But like when you look at hardware encryption, when it enters the game, it doesn't change anything. All these things are still possible. And so it's pretty much equivalent. So finally, there's the PC off and the victim is unaware scenario. And when we look at that, we see that software encryption provides pretty much full confidentiality of the data, so, assuming that the implementation is sound. So you have a couple of options. You can choose open source, preferably audited software. You can use proprietary software with public implementation details. Or you can live on the edge and use a black box implementation. But for hardware, that's pretty much the only option that you have. So no open source auditing fanciness, just the black box. And there's even additional, it's extremely hard to audit. And there's even additional pitfalls that apply to hardware encryption only and not to software. So the takeaway message from this is security guarantees are equivalent at best. And the reason I'm standing here is that it's probably worse. So with that, I'll go through some standards for full disk encryption. So there's two actually. One is from ages back. That's the ATA security feature set, and another is TCG-OPAL. But before I do that, let's first dive into how you would probably implement this. So on the left, you have a user-supplied password. You store 2 salts and a hash. And if you take a keyed hash with one of the salts and the result of it, you compare that to the stored hash. And if that matches, you take the same password and then with the second salt, and that becomes your key. So far, this is easy. Now, if we look at ATA, it's the original, it originated from the pre-self-encrypting drive era, so the word encryption isn't mentioned in the standard whatsoever. There's 2 authentication types, a user and master password, and both are user settable, but the master password has an initial value set during the manufacturing process. And there's a setting called master password capability, which is either high or max. I didn't come up with these names. And high means both user and master password can unlock the drive. And max means only the user can unlock the drive, but the master may still factory reset or erase the drive. Bottom line, you should change that thing or set this setting to max. Otherwise, you have a master password that's factory default that gets access to your data. And also in practice, even that will bite you. So, but we'll get to that later. So on the left, there's a user-supplied password. You put that through the HMAC or like keyed hash or whatever, and then you get a hash result, and you compare that to check the validity of your password. And then you do the same thing with another salt, and you get a key. And with that key, you decrypt some shared key. And with that key, you decrypt another key. And you need this indirection in order to be able to change the user-master password independently. Now there's also TCG-OPAL, and that's actually designed for full disk encryption. It's the de facto for hardware de facto standard. There's multiple partitions, which they call locking ranges, and there's multiple passwords, which they refer to as credentials. And a single credential can unlock multiple ranges, and a single range can be unlocked by multiple credentials. And so this means many to many. And also, one range should be able to be scrambled, that means regenerate the encryption key, independently of all the others and without knowing all the keys that unlock that particular range. So if you look at this, it shouldn't come as a surprise that it's really hard to implement this. It's not impossible, but it's just really hard, and every manufacturer has to do it all over again. So BitLocker fully relies on this. If your drive supports this, then BitLocker will delegate in trust to this drive. There's a few buts and ifs, but that's basically the takeaway message. It doesn't rely on ATA security though. So what are possible pitfalls implementing this scheme? So the first one, and that's actually most important, on the left you see a password coming from the host PC that you enter, and then on the right the data is encrypted with some key. But how they are related, that's unknown. So there's a black box in the middle that does the key management. But you also don't know whether these things are related at all. They might not be. And in that case, you can just, then the key doesn't depend on the password, so all the information that you need to decrypt the data is already stored in the drive. And this is really bad. The second is take a naive approach. You encrypt everything with a single key, and you encrypt that key with all the passwords. Then the weakest password, in theory, allows access to everything. And even if there's no actual permission for that particular range. And there's no cryptographic enforcement for this, just if statements, but you can get around it by messing with the firmware. And BitLocker makes things worse because it actually leaves a single range unprotected always, and that's the partition table. So in that case, sometimes you can actually access the whole contents of the drive without a password. Okay, so there's the third pitfall. There's ATA master password re-enable attack. So bear with me. You should change the master password capability bit to max. But if you do that, this should do away with the key material that allows you to derive the actual encryption key from the master password, ideally. But the standard allows for resetting that bit back to high. And it allows you to do so with the user password only. So you need to be able to reconstruct that data that you just deleted without having the password that's supposed to be used for that. So that's hard. And in practice, this key material is just left there. So if you don't change the master password, then this allows your data to be recovered with the factory default master password. Okay, so final pitfall, there's a where leveling issue. So where leveling means that multiple writes to the same logical sector ends up in writes to different physical sectors. So that can also be applied to key material. So first you get the drive from the factory. There's no encryption key set, but it does encrypt everything with a factory default key. Well, it's randomized, but factory default. And then suppose that you set a password, it overwrites that key with an encrypted variant. And so that variant may actually end up in a different physical sector, and therefore the original might still be there, so you might use that to decrypt the data. Other pitfalls that we looked at but didn't really find is random entropy generation, power saving mode. Sometimes a vendor may choose to do some sort of a hibernation. So all the key material will end up in non-volatile storage in that case, but we didn't find this in practice. And general implementation issues, so mode of operation, side channels, and key derivation mistakes, all that stuff that's in software is still there in hardware. Methodology. So a general approach, we try to fit it in a mold. It's pretty ad hoc, actually. So first step is to obtain a firmware image, gain low-level control over the device for dynamic analysis, and then analyze the firmware. So how do you obtain a firmware image? Well, you download it. That seems easy, but it's hard. There's usually obfuscation applied, and you have to capture SSL traffic, some reverse engineering, etc. And the image may actually be encrypted, and decryption can be done on the unit itself. So that's a dead end. You do need to do something else. Second possibility is to pull the firmware from RAM through JTAG. That's next. So gaining low-level control. JTAG allows you to control the device completely. So you can halt the CPU, set registers, read or write into the address space, whatever you want. Some models have this on the PCB, and others need some figuring out. They obfuscated the pin layout. And an alternative, if it's not enabled, and you can get unsigned code execution, for example, through some undocumented command, exploiting vulnerability, modifying code on the memory chips, and as a last resort, you can try some fault injection attack. So now that you have the firmware, let's analyze it. You have to figure out what it does. So first, in order to do this, you have to figure out the section information. Section information is typically stored in the firmware header. You have to figure it out manually or through some reverse engineering, then load it into a disassembler and check out what it does. Well, this might be like a big thing to look at. So what you probably want to do is, as a first thing to do, is find the ATA dispatch table, which is a table with opcode, function pointer for every ATA opcode, and cross-reference that with the ATA standard. And if you find it, then you can look at interesting opcodes and check out the implementation of that particular command. Results. So we studied models from 2014 to 2018, and different form factors, SATA, NVMe, USB. And most of them have very severe weaknesses. I'll refer to the paper for the actual results. Best case scenario, the security guarantees are equivalent to software full disk encryption and not better. And worst case, it all relies on if statements, so something that you can easily do away with. And BitLocker amplifies the issue by delegating trust to this. Furthermore, TCG OPAL is pretty terrible. It's over-engineered. You have so many features that nobody will end up using. And security goals are not clear because they didn't even manage to be better than just software encryption. And there's also no reference implementation for this. And implementation is not part of the compliance test, which is also important. And yeah, so there's structural changes needed. And this is the timeline. So we started actually researching part-time in October 2016. In the meantime, until April 2018, we did some attempts to contact the vendors. And we actually disclosed the stuff to Samsung and Micron, and we had a meeting with Samsung in The Hague in April 2018. We had a draft paper published in November 2018, and there were software updates released from vendors. Presentation at CCC in December 2018, and actually during that time we also discovered some new SanDisk issues. So that's what we're going to disclose today. There's a couple of CVEs released that became public today. Western Digital released firmware updates available at that address, and also they audited their new firmware updates by this company called 12 Bits. And there's a quote from Western Digital. They thank us and the NCC and the CERT-CC for participating in coordinated disclosure process. And for more information, please see that. All right, so thank you.
All right, questions move to the center, please. Looks like we got a taker, awesome.
Hey, Manuel Egele, Boston University. It's pretty amazing stuff. So I was wondering, from the methodology section that you explained, you can do this, and this, going all the way deeper level. Yep. How far actually do you have to go? Judging from the images, it looks like at least until the JTAG stuff. Did you have to do glitching attacks?
No, we didn't do glitching attacks. We did everything else. So we even found a 0-day in a bootloader from Marvell in order to bypass secure boot. But that's as far as we went.
But that was through manual analysis in IDA?
Yeah, yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. So what's the way forward that you see? I mean, you kind of espouse software, not hardware in the paper, or layering it, I guess, is your compromise. What do you see as the way forward?
Given this, basically delegating trust to these drives. These people aren't security engineers, and we shouldn't give them the task of engineering security. Like, this can be done in software. It has been done in software, and you can just have a simplistic approach. Then you can publish details, and therefore then you can rely on that without having like all these different implementations from different vendors that you cannot audit. I think the way forward would be to just go for a trusted software encryption.
Well, I'd say your work has great impact because Western Digital, because of your work, had Trailbits audit their work, and now you're making them more security aware. So maybe you are now creating more trustworthy self-encrypting drives.
Let's hope so. If you depend on these drives, then yeah, I mean, from a security management point of view, it could make sense. Although, like, I don't think in a security perspective this would be the way forward. But, yeah.
Right. Let's thank our speaker.